One day, a king went hunting and became hopelessly lost in the woods. He was about to give up when an old woman walked out of the shadows.
"You are lost," she said, cocking her head, her skin so loose it seemed to slide along her skull.
"Yes," said the king. "Can you please help me find my way home? I can pay you handsomely." The old witch laughed, a sound like dried leaves caught in a windowsill.
"I will help you find your way home, but you must marry my daughter. She is a beautiful creature, more beautiful than any woman you have ever seen. Nod your agreement, and I will take you to her."
She cocked her head the other way, regarding him deeply. The king thought a moment of his home, his kingdom, and of his children before he nodded. And the witch turned, the forest falling away around them as a clearing formed. In the middle of the clearing stood a cabin, and the king dismounted to follow the witch inside. There, sitting by the fire, was the most beautiful woman the king had ever seen. She curtsied prettily enough, but the king felt his bones freeze. The witch took her daughter's hand and gave her daughter to the king. The journey out of the woods was very easy. The king knew his new wife would not love his 6 sons and beautiful daughter, so he sent word for them to be hidden in a nearby castle. The witch's daughter had the most lavish wedding the kingdom had seen in generations, and was the most radiant bride many of them had ever dreamed of. The king was handsome, and his people said he looked years younger.
The king went to visit his children as soon as he could, then found himself going back every day. As he had expected, life with the new queen was a sweet horror, and he quickly became careless, leaving her for long stretches. The new queen knew something was amiss, and was soon seething at how her husband ignored her. She bribed the servants to tell her where her husband went, furious to discover it was to visit children he'd hidden from her. One evening, she followed him at a safe distance, carefully marking the trees with witchcraft as she passed them, knowing she would need to return to this place on her own.
At the clearing around the charming small castle, the witch watched as 6 young men rushed out to meet their father. They looked happy, bright, and laughing, full of love as they embraced him. The witch queen went back to the castle and gathered 6 shirts, sewing into them a vile enchantment, one taught her by her mother long ago. She spent the night preparing and went to sleep just before dawn. In the morning, the witch queen crept out before her husband woke. She followed the trail of witch marks to the castle, and when the sons saw her approach, they thought she was their father and rushed out to greet her.
The queen threw the shirts over the young men, and when the shirts found their marks, the boys were turned into swans. Startled, they all flew away in a rush of white wings and scattered feathers. The queen returned home, not knowing there was a 7th child, the daughter, still in the castle. Thinking she had gotten rid of all the children, she left smiling at how heartbroken the king would be to discover them gone.
The next day, the king came to visit and found only his daughter left. She told him of the spell, showed him the feathers she had gathered in the garden. He entreated her to return with him to the castle, but she would not, insisting it was his new wife who had done this. Her father did not believe her. She begged him for one more night at the castle to gather her belongings and mementos. The king agreed and said he would return the next day. That night, the daughter crept away into the forest.
She traveled until she was exhausted and finally lay down to sleep on the bank of a stream. When she woke, her brothers were all around her. She hugged them joyously, asking them 1,000 questions, but they told her to keep still.
"We only have a quarter hour in this form," her eldest brother explained.
"Can I help break the enchantment?" she pled.
"It will be very difficult, but there is one way," he said, stroking her hair. "You must be silent for 6 years. Not one word, no laughter."
She was about to answer but closed her mouth and nodded.
He smiled at her and added, "You must also sew 6 shirts of star flowers. When the 6 years is up, we will come to you, and when the shirts are placed upon us, we will be whole again."
She nodded, her eyes shining with tears. She lay down and they nestled around her, keeping her warm and singing her to sleep with the soft rustle of their feathers. In the morning, she woke alone. As she gathered her small pack, she decided to live in the woods for the 6 years. She would have no one to talk to, no reason to laugh, and could gather all the star flowers she needed for the shirts. She had some trouble learning to sew the flowers and often pricked her fingers, but soon built up calluses to the needle. Sometimes she would want to sing, but stopped herself by thinking of her brothers, swans forever if she did so. One day, she heard the distant baying of hounds, signaling hunters approaching. Scurrying up a tree, she sat amongst the upper branches to hide until they were out of the area. Unfortunately, the dogs had picked up her scent and came right to her. The hunters looked up to see the dirty but incredibly beautiful girl in the top branches. They tried to coax her down to the ground, but the girl wordlessly refused.
One of the hunters climbed up to where she was, pulled her from her perch, handing her down to the huntsman below. The girl stood silent as their king arrived. The king was young and handsome. "Who are you, and why are you on my lands?"
She kept her head down, silent as the grave.
He touched her chin and lifted her face to look at him. Despite her silence, the king fell for her, fell in love right then and there. He gathered his own cloak around her and placed her on his horse, holding her close as they rode out of the woods.
The girl looked over his shoulder, her heart aching because all the shirts she had finished were in the woods now, left behind.
Upon returning to his castle, the king ordered the young woman to be cared for as a queen, for that was how he saw her. His mother took an instant dislike to the girl and told her son he was crazy to have brought her home.
"You do not know where she is from. She does not speak, smile, or react in any way," the king's mother warned him. "She could be empty-headed, even dangerous."
The king shook his head, saying, "I know what I need to know. I love her."
The girl behaved with grace and kindness, even though she never spoke. And in a matter of days, the king declared he would marry her and no one else.
The wedding took place, and the young couple was very happy for a time, despite the king's mother constantly telling everyone the girl was not worthy of her son, not worthy of a king.
The girl still refused to speak or laugh. She would spend most of her time sewing shirts made of starflowers and watching the ducks and swans in the castle ponds. Her smiles were the talk of the kingdom, however, so light and beautiful they were, and so rare.
A year later, the young queen had her first child. There was a week of celebrating the birth of a son, and the king was so happy he could not stop telling everyone he met about his amazing child. The king's mother, furious, plotted and planned, and on the last night of revelry, she stole the baby from his crib, leaving behind lamb's blood. After sending the baby away, she went to the king and told him his wife had killed and eaten her own child. The king did not believe it, and spent much time mourning with his wife. The people of the kingdom noticed the young mother did not weep or cry as her husband did, but they told themselves people mourn in different ways, and perhaps her country was more stoic than theirs.
At night, the grief-stricken young queen would walk down to the garden, silent as a ghost, and dig a small hole in the dirt next to the vast gathering of starflowers. There, she would kneel and scream her pain into the dirt, crying with her face pressed to the soil so no sound could escape.
A year later, the young queen had a second child, another son, and there was much celebrating. This time, everyone seemed a little more restrained, nervous, but determined to be joyous. Again, the king's mother crept into the child's room, stole the child, left lamb's blood, and told the king his wife had killed and eaten her baby.
The king was distraught, but he did not believe this of his wife. She stayed still and silent, even when he asked her about it in private. But when she kissed his brow and held him, he felt her love cover him. And at night, the queen would carry her heavy heart and cry hard and long into the sweet earth amongst the starflowers, letting the earth bury the sound of her pain.
Another year passed, and the queen had a third child. There was a small party to greet the new daughter, only those close to the family invited. The king was somber but hopeful.
The old mother crept into the child's room the same night, expecting to take the child and send it off, done with the queen forever. The young queen was waiting, holding her child, and glared at the king's mother, refusing to give up her child.
"You will not make a sound. No one will help you," the king's mother said, coming for the child.
The young queen did not speak, but she knocked the table over, causing a huge crash.
The king's mother smiled, threw the blood on the young queen, and snatched the child before anyone came into the room. She then ran away to hide this child as well. The king and his guards arrived to see the queen covered in blood. "What have you done?" he asked, frantic.
She did not answer, looking up at him without a trace of emotion on her beautiful face.
He had no choice now, the evidence damning, and he ordered her taken to jail.
The young queen snatched up the shirts she had been sewing and walked without a struggle to the cell. Her trial was swift. As she would not speak in her defense, the blood on her dress and hands, as well as the testimony of the king's mother, did her in. She was sentenced to burn at the stake. The day of her execution was the last day of the 6 years. She had finished all of the shirts but one, which was missing a left sleeve. She carried the shirts over her arm as she walked to the stake, her head held high. She stood on the ground before the pile of wood as her sentence was read out. She could see her husband watching, pain in his eyes, and his mother behind him, a triumphant smile on her lips. As the young queen was tied to the stake, the sun was beginning its low, slow fall into twilight, and she could see 6 swans circling the square. Looking up at them, she wanted to cry out, to call them to her, but she had to wait just a little longer, wait until dark.
The executioner lit the fire, and the swans passed over him, beating their wings so hard that the fire went out. Guards came to help him chase away the swans as the sky went pink.
While they held off the swans long enough to get the fire lit, the brothers determined to save their sister, and one got close enough to bite the ropes from her wrists. The young queen threw the shirts over them, crying, "I am innocent," just as the darkness fell.
The crowd watched in awe as the shirts fitted to the 6 brothers, who became human again, now and forever. All but the youngest brother, who had a white wing for a left arm because his shirt was not yet finished.
The king rushed forward in amazement as his wife told the whole story of how she was innocent, how his mother had taken the children and hidden them. She told him the story of her brothers, told him the story of her father and his new wife, and spoke so much that the king had no choice but to laugh in joy at the sweet sound of his wife's voice.
The stolen children were found and brought home to live with their parents and 6 uncles. The king could not execute his mother, but he sent her to live in the remote castle where the 6 brothers and their sister had lived so many years ago. All of them lived happily ever after, especially the youngest brother. He found many ways to make that wide white wing work to his advantage.